When I first told Grandpa that I had gotten engaged, he seemed positively over the moon with happiness. He had always liked Jess and had actually mentioned to me on several occasions that it was about time you stopped courting and made an honest woman of this girl. He could never quite get his head around the idea that we just wanted to live together first, before actually tying the knot. For him and his old-fashioned values, it seemed like I was doing things the wrong way around. So when I finally did work up the courage to ask Jess and got the response that I wanted in the form of a big fat yes, he was as happy as me as anyone in the family. When I told him the venue we were planning to have our ceremony, however, his entire demeanor changed. His face literally seemed to fold in on itself. His brow collapsed downward as if someone had triggered an avalanche inside his skull, whilst the lines on his forehead crumpled together like an accordion of disgust and revulsion. He had also never been a man able to conceal his emotions, and though he tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing and that he was just a bit under the weather, I could tell immediately there was something wrong. A week passed, and for some reason in all that time, my grandfather never once mentioned the engagement, the wedding, or the reason why his mood had suddenly shifted. In the end, it was left to me to bring it up, explaining how I'd been in contact with the church and spoken to the priest about our dates. Again, my grandfather recoiled. "You don't even go to church," he said, petulantly. "Why would you want to go and make a big song and dance up there? You haven't been there inside that place for what, about 20 years? By up there, he meant up Croker's Hill, past the cemetery at the top of Morton, and on to All Saints Church. Watching him from across the room, muttering angrily to himself as I prepared his dinner, I decided enough was enough, and that I needed to find out what was bothering him. Pulling up a stool in front of his armchair, I placed his dinner onto a TV tray and plonkered myself down with a sigh. "What do you suddenly have against churches? Never heard you have any problem with it before," I asked wearily. "It isn't churches," he replied, taking a great mouthful of food and shoveling it into his mouth, chewing slowly and making me wait patiently for the end of the sentence, which he punctuated by slamming down his fork with a clang. "It isn't churches, it's that church. That place. It's bloody rotten, I'm telling you. Have you never heard about the Morton First 11? Again I sighed, realizing that this was going to be another of my grandfather's tales. Some superstitious story he had picked up in his youth and which had scarred him as if it were a branding iron, leaving an indelible mark on his beliefs. Slowly I shook my head and raised myself from the stool so as to sit on the couch beside him. If this was going to be one of his stories, I thought, I'd better settle in for the long haul. Over the course of the next 2 hours, my grandfather told me the story of All Saints Church, the Wishing Trees, and the Morton Starting 11. To say it influenced my decisions going forward would be a bit of an understatement. "Years ago," my grandfather had begun, in the same way that he seemed to start all of his stories nowadays. Nothing of note seemed to have happened to him in the last few decades. "I used to go to school in Morton, and every week on Friday, we'd all be marched out of school and up to Croker's Hill to All Saints for a service. Going to chapel, they called it, though there was no actual chapel involved. We'd all have to take confession and sit there in silence whilst the other lads went in one by one to talk to the priest and tell him what sins they'd committed that week. Then there'd be a mass and the whole lot of us would get marched back down to school for lunch and afternoon lessons. I suppose it was a bit boring in some ways, but I can't say I minded it much. Sitting in the church in silence always seemed a better option than being shouted at by one of those horrible teachers we had in those days. So I personally never cared. Plus, on certain Fridays, whenever chapel fell on a saint's feast day or a holy holiday of obligation, we got to do the thing with the wishing rags. That part I actually enjoyed." I stared at my grandfather blankly. I knew that having attended a Catholic school, he was corralled into attending these weekly services. He told me many times how he and his classmates would spend an hour every morning when they should have been learning sitting cross-legged on a wooden floor of the school, all whilst they practiced hymns for what seemed like an eternity. He also told me how he once got in huge trouble for having eaten meat on a Friday, something which, though was quite old-fashioned but of Catholic superstition, was completely forbidden at his school. The fact that he'd eaten the meat outside of school time was the only thing that saved him from suspension. What he had never told me before, what he had never even mentioned, and what I had never heard even the faintest hint of was the so-called wishing trees and wishing rags. To me, it had the distinct smell of bullshit. It was quite simple, really. Apparently they do it in a lot of countries, or at least something similar. At the end of Mass, every boy who received communion would be given a piece of cloth, a rag, or a strip of cotton from an old shirt or something. Usually about 12 centimeters long, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters wide. Some lads would bring their own fancy pant strips, bits of ribbon, or a satin that their mother had given them. But most of the boys just had these bits of dish rags. Anyway, the idea was that on certain days of the year, you'd be given one of these pieces of cloth. You'd take it outside to the old yew trees that marked the border between the All Saints churchyard and the cemetery. These were massive old trees with big gnarly branches that drooped down over the churchyard. The idea then was that you tied your piece of cloth, your ribbon or whatever to the branch of the tree and made a wish. If your wish was granted, then you would come back, remove the cloth from the tree and give it to someone else. It was daft, I suppose, but when all the kids in the congregation did it, the whole tree would be covered with these weird knotted pieces of cloth, as if they'd grown out in place of the leaves or berries. It actually used to look quite good, a bit magical, you know. Until Martin spoiled it. I actually remember hearing Martin ask the question, who are we actually asking to grant these wishes? He asked the priest, if we want God to grant a wish, why don't we just pray inside the church? Why do we have to do this tying the ribbon stuff unless we're praying to the tree or someone else? The priest assured Martin that the ribbon, strips, and rags were just a tradition, that it was always God that we would direct our wishes and prayers to, no matter how we did it. But what if? Martin continued, unsatisfied by the answer. What if someone wished for something bad? Like something horrible or terrible, or something to get hurt. Who would they pray to then? Shocked by the implications of Martin's question, the priest basically just shushed him and refused to answer, moving away to another part of the churchyard rather than dealing with such silly and impertinent questions. However, Martin didn't move. Martin was thinking, and he had an experiment. He was an odd boy, Martin. Quiet lad, you know. Kept to himself. He was never picked for sports, never participated in any activities. He was just basically in the background. I can't say I ever saw anyone actually bully him or single him out. I mean, they might have done, but I never saw it. As far as I know, he didn't hate the others because they picked on him, but more because they didn't acknowledge him at all. To popular kids, he was just a bit of a irrelevance, like wallpaper or a lock on a cupboard door. I mean, you sort of knew he was there, but you never paid full attention. After a few days, Martin had been quizzing the priest. Our whole class was kept back after school. We were questioned about a book that had gone missing from the school library, and which the librarian wanted to find. To start, we were told that nobody could leave until the book was found, but eventually they had to let us go because nobody admitted to taking it. By the next day, we all knew it was. When we came into class the following morning, there were 2 pages torn from a book nailed to the blackboard. The pages showed a drawing from the 1780s of the old yew trees at the top of the hill, all covered in wishing rags. What was funny about the drawings was that the church was nowhere to be seen. Turns out it wasn't built until 30 years later. What the picture showed was the tradition of the wishing rags in Morton predating the building of the church. As the information on the other page showed, it was a pagan custom far older than the arrival of Christianity and at a time involving wrapping threads of cotton or plaits made from wheat stalks onto the branches. Martin was proving a point, though why he was proving it we could only guess. I suppose in his head, the meaning of the message was clear, but to everyone else it was just weird. As far as I remember, none of us took it as a warning. For the next few weeks, nothing special happened except that it got colder. We'd still all traipse up to the church on Friday morning, only now we did it in the rain, the early morning fog, and once or twice in the snow. Somehow on those days, the whole experience was a lot less pleasant. Even when you got inside the church, on those days, sitting in the pews in silence, huddled up against the chill and the drafts, you'd watch the candles flickering and maybe start to think about what Martin had said. To wonder at least for a moment about other gods older than the one we were praying to and who had been on this land far, far longer. It was only a month later when a feast day rolled around and we were given again rags to tie around the branches of the tree that we noticed anything weird. On that day, Martin didn't take a piece of rag from inside the church. Instead, he tied up his own pieces of cloth, black strips of silk that he brought from home. He tied each one slowly and deliberately, taking several minutes with his eyes closed to make his wishes clear. We all saw him do this, including the priest, who, as Martin was leaving, called after him, saying that each person was only allowed to have one rag and one wish. As he was walking away, Martin was heard laughing, and according to at least 2 boys close to him at the time, replied by saying, "Who are you to speak for them?" A week later, the Mortons, starting 11, our entire school football team, were killed in a car accident. They had been on their way to another school in the next county for a match when their minibus had collided with another car. 2 teachers, the driver and 2 substitutes survived. Possibly the boys at school started to say something because their names were not written on the black silk rags that Martin tied to the tree. The idea that Martin had wished death on 11 of his classmates for virtually no reason sounds far-fetched. The only real connection being that he happened to tie 11 rags on that particular day. Even so, my grandfather absolutely believed it to be true. "He cursed them," he said quietly. "Not because they were bad, but because he could. Just to show that he could." According to my grandfather, Martin never came back to school. Some say that he moved away, but that he had to return to Morton a few years later. "I don't know about that," my grandfather said. "What I do know is that within a fortnight of them 11 boys dying, the old yew trees by the church, the trees that had been there for hundreds of years, shriveled up and died. Both of them had turned completely black." A week after this conversation, I did the climb up to the church to see the spot that he had been talking about. Ostensibly, Jess and I had gone up to All Saints to meet with the priest and take a look at the church. But really, I was there to get a feel for the place. Despite the grandeur of the building and the friendliness of the priest, I couldn't help noticing to the right of the building, in a patch by the wall, the stubby, overgrown remnants of what had once been 2 yew trees, stuck out from the ground, jagged and black like a pair of rotten teeth. Having seen the spot for ourselves, Jess and I decided we preferred to marry somewhere else.